Before we get started, I have a question for you. What are you working on? Comment down below and let me know. So I've been poking around the Pontiac groups a lot lately, and I've kind of noticed guys looking at options on getting more horsepower out of their cars. And typically they're only using really 3 cams. These 3 cams are the 2801, the 068, and the 41 cam. These cams are fine, but they do leave some things on the table. The 41 cam is probably the best bet out of all these for horsepower, but a lot of guys say you need longer valves for those. I don't necessarily think that. For the most part, you should be able to do with valve springs. But let's take a look at some of these cams on some desktop dyno software to really see what these cams do to your engine, so you have an actual idea of what's going on when you choose a cam. And I'm also going to throw in the bonus cam that I recommend for almost every Pontiac build. That's a flat tappet setup, and one for a hydraulic roller setup as well. So the most basic cam is actually the 066 cam. This is like the standard 2 and 4 barrel cam. This comes in at, looks like 200 in, 210 for duration out, 410 and 410 lift on intake and exhaust. That's pretty small, but it's a pretty standard number for the Pontiacs, so it is what it is. But let's run that cam in our desktop dyno and actually see what we end up with. It's important to note that this is with the factory 6X4 heads. So I do want to make note that this engine is set up with a 6X4 head setup. That essentially means it's 7.8 to 1 compression ratio. That gives us the ability to run E10 octane. Really cheap gas to be able to drive this car all the time. 6X4 heads factory aren't known for being great flowers. They flow maybe like 211 CFM. That's really not a ton. I mean, that's like 350 horsepower capable. So that is a discussion for another video. We'll get into that probably the next day or two. But let's get back on this and do an actual test. So you're going to calculate the performance of that, and you're going to see this engine not only kind of peters out around like 4,500 RPM, you get your torque early at 4,000. So if you're going to run a standard stall in this, you're going to be, 200 horsepower-ish at that point at 2,400 RPM, but really that peak at 4,500 is only 341 horsepower. That's not really a ton, but a lot of guys will step up to the 068 cam. Now that 068 cam is essentially the same lift, it's just a little longer duration and a little bit different lobe separation angle. So that is going to be a 212, 225, again 410, 410, and 116 degrees lobe separation angle. This cam is a super early max cam, so that, so actually the street manners of the 068 is probably actually better than the 066 cam because the lobe separation angle, the same lift height, but a little longer duration. It'd probably act the same, but it'd probably have more vacuum more than likely because of the lobe separation angle. So let's hit that on here. So you see by just changing the cam duration and a little bit longer lobe separation angle, and going to the 116 degree lobe separation angle, you're really starting to get more power up here across the board. So let's hit the actual chart, and you see your gains really outweigh your losses down here. The little bit longer overlap really helps this engine actually breathe a little bit better. So you're getting up there higher in the RPM range, pushing your power a little more, and you see you push your peak torque out another like 500 RPM. That's a big deal across the board, and you lost some down below. But if you go back to our averages, you're going from 352 average foot-pounds of torque to 359. That's a pretty big jump with only a 2 peak gain. You've also gained 20 horsepower at the peak with almost, with 10 more extra horsepower on average over the entire range. And this is from 1,500 to 6,000 RPM. And if you're using a big stall, that's not a big deal. Your average horsepower is going to go up because you're going to be using only a certain range of that horsepower in torque curve. So the second upgrade cam, some guys opt for the 041. This is a fairly big cam as far as Pontiacs go. This is like the holy grail Ram Air 4 cam. You've got big numbers like 231, 240 duration, so there's a little bit of overlap there. And that does give you a little more lope quality, as well as the shorter LSA at 114. So it's still got plenty of vacuum to run power brakes, things like that, if you want to go that route. The 470 lift is a lot more lift. The other cams can be made to do that using 1:6:5 ratio rockers. But if you go that route, you might need to change your push rod length. Maybe go to a lash system instead of the torque to yield system that Pontiac typically uses, which is recommended anyway. So with that said, let's jump into getting this cam. So with that cam virtually installed, let's go ahead and get this thing fired up. So again, we see 20 horsepower gains here. I mean, cams matter. Cams are what essentially gives your engine the ability to use air. That said, the engine will only use what it can use. If your heads are too small, if your exhaust is too small, if the intake isn't flowing right, you're not going to have the ability to get all of this air into your engine and out of your engine. But let's dive deeper into these numbers to actually see what we need to do to get a good cam for our Pontiac engines. And again, we see our peak torque number hasn't changed at all. So by a lot of the YouTube and website guys, this did nothing. But if you look here, it jumped up 4 average torque across the board. That's a big deal on the track. Your peak horsepower went from 361 to 389. That's a huge jump. Brought our average from 255 to 266. Again, a huge jump. This is again with 89 octane. And we could step this up with more compression, which would probably break us over the 400 point. If you're running a 10.5 engine, that would likely do it. These losses are just a function of a cam. I mean, if you go with a bigger cam, typically you will lose your low end. Typically. Some cams don't. There are exceptions to the rule, like always. Think of this essentially as the 68 is a stage 1. This is a stage 2 cam. Anything beyond that, like a 513 thumper or something like that, is essentially a stage 3 cam, and they can be unwieldy to actually run. That said, they make a lot of power. Personally, I'm willing to give up a lot of low end down here. Since I'm running a 2400 RPM stall, I'm not really going to lose much. And it's going to be right at my peak torque when that stall decides to actually kick in. Almost 30 numbers different in some spots, some numbers almost 50 or 60 numbers different. So it matters if you want to rev that car out and push this thing to like 5,700 RPM for a shift point. But if you're wanting a really cheap option, Summit has a 2801 cam. This thing is freaking phenomenal for what it is. It's like 80 bucks. I'll put a link in the description down below for you to check that out if you want to check that out. But let's pop that into this and see what it actually does. It's an in-between cam. So it's a 214, 224. Again, between those two of the 66, 68, and the 41. But now that that is on here, let's go ahead and do this test. Let's go ahead and put this against the 066 stock cam. And this is one of those cams that I was talking about that you really don't lose on. I mean, it's got some losses down low, and it's got a lot of gains up high. This is an excellent option. So this cam really doesn't lose much down low at all, if any. It's a couple numbers down low, but really at 1500 RPM, you're never going to notice that. And all of the gains above 4000 RPM, you're definitely going to notice that. Mind you, again, this is also a pretty small cam, and it's a really safe cam to put in your car if you are just trying to get something in there to sell. They're like 80 bucks. So they're kind of hard to argue with for the price if you need a cheap build to just get going. But let's be honest, we don't really care about the stock cam. We're not going to keep that thing in there. So what does this cam do against the 068 cam, which it's probably meant to be going against anyway? So we see here, it's basically just a cheap knockoff of the 068 cam. I mean, it really is. It's really close to the performance of it at about half the price. I mean, that's a big deal if you're trying to save some money. I told you guys I'm going to throw in my pick for my cam choice. This is the 2802 Summit cam. I really like this cam. For the price for what you get, and the actual performance of the engine, dude, it's phenomenal. It does state that it requires a little more compression, but that doesn't seem to be the case for the most part. It does have some bleed off, but it's not a big deal. Put that into the software and see what it says we end up with for that same $80 price. So we're gonna start with a test that actually makes the most sense here. Obviously, the 2801 and the 2802 come from Summit, right? And they're both $80. So what one are you gonna buy? Let's do that comparison really quick, because obviously I think the 2802 is the better cam. I think it really calms down the engine and makes it more of a driver. So the 2802 comes in at 224, 234 lift duration, as well as 466 and 488 intake and exhaust lift. It also has a fairly long 114 degree lobe separation angle, so the vacuum should still be really, really good for power brakes and things like that as well. As you can see on the chart, any losses incurred by the 2802 is really negated at 3,000 RPM, which, I mean, if you're racing the engine, you're not going to be there long anyway. You're going to be above that for the most part, because a lot of guys will run a 2200, 2400, maybe even a 3,000 RPM stall and just get there without having to worry about it if you're drag racing especially. Yeah, and at 5,000 RPM, we're talking the difference of 383 horsepower instead of 357. That's a big difference in the quarter mile and eighth mile. That said, this cam does say you should use different valve springs. A lot of guys say you don't have to because it is within Pontiac spec. It's up to you. I would suggest changing valve springs out always. Whether you're using a stock cam or not, you might as well switch valve springs out for the right ones for your application. Okay, mind you, this is only what's possible with flat tappet cams. I want to talk to you guys for 1 second about hydraulic rollers and why they're way better, and why they should be your choice for your next build for your Pontiac engine. I mean, first off, you don't have to break them in. You put the rollers in and they just work. There's a slight braking process, I guess, but even at that, I mean, it's a couple of minutes instead of 20 minutes of nerve-wracking, nail-biting, waiting for your engine to die. That sucks. Another massive advantage is the freeing up of power. I mean, you really don't have the friction that you have with a flat tappet cam, as well as the wear points of a flat tappet cam. Those things do wear. But let me show you what my pick for this cam is, and we'll kind of go into a little bit of why I believe it's a better choice. So before we do this test, I want to talk to you guys about this crane cam. This crane cam is large. If you're going through the effort of putting a hydraulic roller into a Pontiac, you're not doing it cheaply. It's a very expensive process versus flat tappet. Summit cams are like 80 bucks. Hydraulic rollers start out at like 450 bucks for the most part. That's not counting the lifters. That's just the cam. I'm just going to assume your heads are machined to accept these valve springs and things like that, because it's not cheap if you're looking at these. But let's look at this just for fun. So this cam is a 242, 252 duration cam. This is a pretty big cam. Lots of overlap, lots of rowdy noise. So it's like a 3,400 RPM to 6,800 RPM cam. That's a pretty rowdy Pontiac. The heads will never flow this for a stock 6X4. They just won't. I'm gonna teach you guys a little bit of porting before and after. Once this cam is set up on the software, I'll show you guys what porting heads can actually do for you. But to go along with that long duration, there's also a pretty big lift. Over half an inch, 0.558 lift in and out. That's huge. But now that you know the specs, let's hit the button. But let's put it against our 2802 and see how it does. I mean, you see huge losses under here, like 2,400 RPM, but again, if you're running a 3,000 RPM stall, you'll never notice that. And really, you'd only want to run a 2,400 RPM stall with this cam anyway. You know, the engine is pretty mechanically limited. But we broke 400 horsepower with this cam. But this engine is really mechanically limited. But let's go ahead and throw some ported heads on it just to see what it'll do. So the ported head flow numbers are put into place, so let's go ahead and run this. So like everything in engine building, it's a give and take relationship. You see the give and take here. I mean, that's a gain of almost 40 horsepower at 5,500 RPM, and it carries to 6,000. We can make this engine keep going if we change a few more things to 65, 68, maybe 7,000 RPM. But really, for Pontiacs, we don't recommend that because they tend to kind of fall apart. They don't like high RPM. It's usually why guys go high displacement, big cam, lots of overlap, lots of air, big pumps. But with that little teaser, we're going to discuss heads in the next video. So go ahead and subscribe for that. If you guys like what we're seeing, please give this video a like. Have a good one, and I'll see you on the road.